welcome to episode 36 of the Bamboo Chalupa Digital Marketing Podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the founder of Knucklepuck, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So today we have a very special guest on the show with us, a good friend of mine for many years and the co-host of the Verbal Tap Comedy MMA podcast. We have Kevin Phillips with us, one of the actual inspirations when Nate and I decided to start Bamboo Chalupa. Kevin is one of the first people that we went to talk to, and we're really excited for him to join us to talk a little bit about building an audience online, specifically focusing on starting with the Verbal Tap podcast.
Stoked to be here. We can also see each other, and these two gentlemen are good looking. So all that knowledge you've been throwing, it's just not fair that it's also wrapped in a good looking package. That's just a note to the audience. Congrats on 36 too. 3 past the lifespan of Jesus. That's not bad.
There you go.
There's a lot of good numbers there.
I like it. We were talking before we hit the record button here that we started Bamboo Chalupa in January of 2014, but Verbal Tap has actually been around since November of 2012. So you're the OG in the podcast space, at least around our crowd here. So what kind of got you into starting the podcast? Kind of give us the background of what drove you to be able to kind of kick this off.
Yeah, that's a super easy just in terms of my friend Rafa Esparza, who I've known for a long time since competitive speech. We both did it in grad school because we're extra cool.
They were their only friends.
Yeah. So he is a comedy writer in LA. He was working at The Tonight Show. He and I were both training BJJ, and I'm living in DC. Just kind of doing that lifestyle.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with MMA, what is BJJ?
Yeah, I was going to hit the acronyms, and you're going to have to help me out on that because it's bad.
Go.
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is grappling, just competitive grappling. And we both do a little kickboxing, Muay Thai boxing in there as well, which is how you encompass mixed martial arts, right? Add some wrestling. You've got all of the brands, Taekwondo, sure. People are like, karate? It's like, yeah, especially if your hand is connecting with another individual, is usually full contact, MMA, any martial art counts. That's what we were doing. We were doing BJJ and talking about it. On Twitter specifically, we would get into arguments during UFC fights or agreements or just improv games. It started because people were enjoying the conversation and we took it on air. That was the whole mission is this entertaining? It seems to be on Twitter. So let's see if it is via podcast. 2012, if people are really registering, podcasts are pretty well known now. 2012 is right when they were getting known. That's right when everyone started doing a podcast. Every athlete, every comedian, every news broadcaster, NPR was like, oh, we found our market finally, and everyone else jumped on. So that's why it went from a conversation on Twitter to a podcast.
Right. And I imagine a lot of the folks back in, when you started would do it's like starting a blog where everybody wants to start a blog. You write for 3 weeks and then all of a sudden, you lose the momentum, you lose the interest. But you guys have actually been able to stick it out successfully for many years.
I'm just thinking about my blog sophomore year of college. You're absolutely right. Yes. So my question first to you guys, how many episodes did you sit down and agree to do a certain amount of episodes, a certain amount of time? What was you've been doing it for 2 years now. How did you stick it through? What was your decision?
I don't know if we had a set number. I remember that we were thinking maybe like 6 months would be a solid go at it. And, we had a certain number of topics, but I don't remember a certain deadline that we agreed to.
Yeah, I don't think we never kind of booked it up, but we came up with a couple of ideas. We knew that we wanted to record once every 2 weeks or publish once every 2 weeks because we didn't want to get too far out of it because obviously our background is very heavy into the content marketing space. So we all know
and you're busy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Everybody's trying to earn some money on this conversation while living and paying rent.
Exactly. Yeah. But we kind of had looked at it where we knew that, we have a very intimate exposure to blogs that the non-starters, the ones that everybody says, yeah, I want to write to a blog. So I got the domain. I'm going to pay somebody because I don't want the free template. I won't write to it if it's not a professionally designed template. We realized that really at first we had to create that proof of concept. We had to show ourselves that we were going to commit to this, that we were going to kind of trudge through the parts that were not going to be so fun, the parts where we weren't necessarily getting the listeners, that the podcast weren't getting the downloads, but we wanted to have this be something where it can be a little bit more of a fluid way for us to talk about something that we're passionate about.
Cool. We had roughly the same conversation, but we did put some numbers, and you can kind of hear it. We're already saying like we put 6 months, and Brett's building in something that everyone should plan for in almost every endeavor. The breakup period, like that lapse, and like, well, this isn't as fun as it was for the first 4 months. So same idea. We were both wanting to do this with a comedy goal in mind. We really thought jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts had made a huge brand jump over 3 years and provided us with an opportunity to be on the next wave of whatever this is. And this, if people out there have not listened to it, get into just Google grappling. Like, you'll find the sport has really emerged. It went from something that people watched because they thought like, you were fighting in your backyard in a tank top in like 10 years to being a real sport that ESPN covers. That's a big jump. Just in terms of, I'd say the UFC is pretty much beating the hell out of boxing too, just in terms of everyone caring right now. That's what we thought would be helpful. So we said, let's do 10 with the intent to do 50. And that was it. It was a 50 episode commitment that ended up going by much faster than we thought. On a week to week, we try and publish once a week. No more than 2 hours per podcast is usually somewhere where we in the hour to 2 hour range. And it's been pretty manageable, especially given we'll kind of stock interviews, which is really helpful.
All right. Well, that's an interesting way to frame how you got started. But talk to us a little bit about how you got early traction and got the early growth. You mentioned the interviews. Was that a critical part of the early growth stage?
Yes. And here's our method on this. One, we're both comedians / jackasses with zero authority to talk about things like punching someone in the face routinely or getting punched in a competitive way. So there was
a non-competitive way.
Any way in which someone's getting punched is not a way I'm living my life on a day-to-day basis. And I'm happy about that. But what we thought was, well, we'll bring people in that do know about these things. And they're a ton of fun to talk to, which was also partially on the comedy side. There were some already serious type shows, and we wanted to talk to these guys in a more fun way because there seemed to be this growing jackassery on the social medias about like having a huge sense of humor amongst the grab, as any community will. And no one was giving the fighters a chance. No one was giving them a chance to be funny. No one was giving them a chance to talk about their competitive piano skills. Like, it was very bizarre what fighters wanted to talk about, and it was great. We absolutely loved it. Most recently, even someone that we had initially started talking to because he just really liked talking about combatives, Tim Kennedy, who's been on Hunting Hitler now. So we've gotten to hear some of his insight about what is going on in his life. And those interviews build a local audience, most specifically. Meaning, if you like the fighter or you train with the fighter, you're more likely to listen to it. And I have given Brett this book. It's called Made to Stick. It's a PR idea.
We had all of our folks at Knuckle Puck read that for our book club.
Great. Awesome book. One of the rules that they discuss is make it local. We are always trying to do that. So social media, interviews, people we meet, people we like, however we can get their name and them in on the podcast and helping us with the podcast and promoting it. That's what we try to do, to build an audience. And that's why we interview people.
I think
that a little bit to go a little bit more into the example from Made to Stick, and you heard Kevin talk about the idea of looking for names. There was a newspaper, I forget where it was, but it was somebody who owned a local newspaper.
North Carolina.
North Carolina newspaper. And he was tasked with growing the subscriptions for that newspaper base. And he had what we've talked about on the podcast, I believe, before, called the commander's intent, where you have to have one ultimate goal, one kind of concise goal that you have for your team to be able to motivate them. And his commander's intent was to get as many names as possible in the newspaper, because that really resonated with their audience. People wanted to see their names. They wanted to see people that they know. And people were much more willing to engage with that newspaper if they had more of a personal connection to it.
I also really like how you mentioned when you're trying to get interviewees that you gave them an opportunity to talk about what they wanted to talk about. I think that leads into a lot of what me and Brett have talked about with doing outreach and doing PR. You have to figure out that angle about how can I help the other person do what they want to do? And you're able to engineer that win-win situation where, you end up getting them on the podcast and you end up getting in front of their audience. I think that's a really, really cool approach that you could take.
Which is a model that we're pretty patently stealing from the late night community. It's like it works across the way, right? People don't stop by the Tonight Show just to talk about how good looking they are. Like they usually have a movie to promote, something's going on. It's kind of like that in terms of where it's led to, which is on a much less superficial level, but on a much more fun level. People will come on and talk about local grappling charities. They'll talk about drives they're doing to donate or get a school started somewhere. And we just had some people that were working heavily in Honduras, the murder capital of the world, to try and get BJJ started because they've seen a ton of success getting younger children engaged in martial arts. I mean, this is obviously in the United States, we've embraced this wholly, and most developed countries obviously have. But they're still working it hard to keep people safe out there. And it's become a cool place that people will come by and talk about that. And they'll even talk about MMA fiction, which we just had someone come by because they specifically wrote a very tantalizing MMA science fiction book. And it might have been the first one that was written purely fictional. So comes in all shapes and sizes, which is great.
There you go. And there's a concept that we talk about a lot where, the kind of aligns with this. And that's this idea of ego baiting, where if you can give somebody a reason to work for you, and by work for you mean to promote your podcast, you put their name in the title, it gives them a reason to promote it for you. It gives them some sort of vested interest in the success of that podcast by having at least some inherent participation in it. And it's something that translates across any medium that you need to market things in. To be able to recognize who that audience is and be able to find a way to genuinely and authentically engage with that audience on a person-by-person basis, something that I know is a huge challenge and something that I've actually just started coming out in against the idea of how do you scale all of these strategies, because personalization doesn't scale. So what can you find that's repeatable? And that just comes down to being able to create these genuine connections with people and then using those connections to be able to benefit both parties.
That's ego baiting. I didn't know about that. I've never heard that term before, but it's really helpful and it's interesting.
Yeah, it's one where you, especially with link building, when it comes on the SEO side, where we can give you some of our acronyms, Kevin. We're link building. Links are a massive element of search engine rankings in terms of how they evaluate quality. But being able, and how do you get people to link to you? Kind of a foundation of marketing. How do you get people to talk about you? How do you get people to listen to your podcast? How do you get people to engage with your social media jackassery? You got to find some way to connect with them. And this idea of ego baiting allows you to kind of take a one-to-many approach, where if you can create a relationship with a key influencer in your space and be able to kind of parlay their reputation into supporting your marketing goals, is something that is not only genuine and authentic, but is something that does scale much easier than some of these other kind of lather, rinse, repeat strategies that are going to have diminishing returns on the second time, let alone trying to do it 4, 5, 6, 10 times over and over.
May I give you an example of one we did that was wildly successful and very niche market? So sort of both ideas, personal and successful. My podcast co-host is an evil genius at engaging people. One, because he doesn't sleep and he loves it. That's essentially what he did here. He started a month-long countdown to the big WWE event, Royal Rumble, where he got people from the fight community to just start submitting their favorite MMA versions of WWE moves. 31 days of countdowns. And I was like, oh, great. 7 people are going to be really interested in that. So effing wrong. It's ridiculous. It ended up making locals, the whole MMA world blew up about it. Fighters were submitting videos that we didn't even ask for. Almost 58 different submissions came in from different schools around the country.
That's crazy.
It went nuts. So it's just one of those, he found an idea that it's like, oh, it turns out a ton of the people that love MMA were raised WWE nerds and were just waiting for a moment to send in their favorite version. It was nuts.
Well, let's talk about the topics the topics that you discuss. I mean, you mentioned this countdown. But I mean, do you guys have a process where you try to make that repeatable? I mean, how do you know that this idea will resonate with your audience versus another one?
You get lucky if you just keep throwing ideas at them. We've found one, we had some small buildups to your point where we had done like a first picture of him just doing a WWE move to me, and it got a lot of momentum. And he said, "Oh, okay." And he had started to really see an emerging market of these two people combined, these two communities really interested in one another, and went that way. And that's just sort of trying things along the way. I don't know if there's a more scientific way than kind of putting those feelers out and sort of expanding on the ones that have a little success.
To ask it another way, then, how do you find something where it's like, hey, maybe if it's not the exact same idea, but how do you now look at this and say, ooh, could we do 31 days leading up to this event? Could we do 15 days? Is there some way that you can take, how do you extract ways to be able to, again, not just to do exactly the same thing, but to figure out what about this was successful and how can we do more of what works and do less of what doesn't?
Yeah, and this is a really fascinating question. I like talking to you guys about this. This is fun. We talk all the time, Raph and I do. So we're constantly there are three ways to tier this. One, both of us consume massive amounts of MMA media. We just don't ever stop. We're in the news, the Google News. You just have to be. If you're not paying attention, you're not going to be able to be informed. If you're not informed, people aren't really that interested. So number one is stay informed. Two, we'll help spur a good chunk of the conversation with people, right? So we'll kick up a storm and be like, hey, what do you guys think about this most recent? We just went through a huge controversy where a major grappling organization wasn't paying its fighters to the point where there was a mini protest. And this grappling organization had already offended women earlier, so this wasn't their worst. We ended up cutting together a documentary for the ladies' jiu-jitsu community and sort of posting a response to his messages. Later, we did a live reading of this, and this is where we're just we'll talk back and forth and be like, how can we elevate this? How can we entertainingly provide some controversy? How can we entertainingly provide the news? How can we entertainingly provide this boring story? So most recently we had we brought in friends of ours from the BJJ community, fighters, journalists, to read parts of this really dramatic press clipping war that happened between the fight promoter and some fighters. So the second one is just be creative with the way we present it, because that's a way where I think what we've heard is it was a playoff. I was like, gosh, if I listen to one more boring podcast where they read me court exhibits, I'm going to lose my mind. Please summarize for me. I don't need to hear it verbatim. And he was like, yeah, somebody was just reading whole press clippings. And we were like, okay, well, how do we make that more fascinating? So we got people to mock that version, but still present the story. So it's just creative. And the third is we just try a lot of things.
Yeah, are there any things that you try that you don't publish? How do you go about the ideas that you try? What makes the cut? How do you go about determining when you're trying all these things and when you talk as often as you do, what makes the cut in terms of worthy of publishing to the audience at large?
Does it make us laugh, and does it make us laugh in a smart way? We're in comedy, so there's a gut reaction, especially in a sort of jock culture, to make the easy joke, and we see it a lot, and it hurts our stomach. That easy joke is like, oh, finally got beat by a girl, something like that. You get the basic gist,
right?
So
the female comedian dropping the F-bomb kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
or saying different harsh language. And I think Always Sunny did a whole episode about that, where Dee went in there and just ran her mouth about nonsense, and people laughed because it was a woman using dirty language. And it was just to stay away from those crutches there.
And that's always our goal. So we do some creative, and we do that a lot of ways. So we'll create memes. We'll just kind of create jokes that if it works and if it makes us laugh, much like we'll produce them. It's not always funny because we have ventured into the journalistic side where we've accidentally gotten intermingled with the credible journalists. We do cover events, which is where, we'll just kind of cover events straight up. We don't always put a comedy taste unless that's what people want. We're more than happy to do that too. So we'll cover local events, and this gets back to how do you build an audience? We go to the places these people are. My co-host is in LA, So he goes to UFC events when we're press passed and they're local. He goes to a lot of grappling events. We go to Muay Thai smokers, is what they call them. How cool is that name, by the way?
That is
Smokers.
pretty
This is
sweet.
amazing.
That's what they call their tournaments. And those are the most brutal things on the planet, by the way. Don't be fooled. Muay Thai smokers, Google this stuff and you will get lost in a wormhole of violence. Like, it is really precision striking on a massive level. Plus, I don't know that they test for steroids, so take that for what it's worth. But the Muay Thai smokers are great. We go to the events. It's a ton of fun. Local MMA, oh man, that's good entertainment. It's very good entertainment.
So I think it's been interesting where we kind of approached this at first being like, all right, well, how did you build an audience with the podcast? But it sounds like the podcast is just kind of one aspect by which you built this brand. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because I think a lot of people get really focused on, and Nate, I know you can kind of speak to this as well, where people get focused on these vanity metrics. They focus on, how do I get keyword rankings? And I've said this before, and I say it to clients, I say it to my team all the time. It's like, the reason that I won't report on keyword rankings, that isn't a focus for me, because I tell my clients, like, you bring me a bill you can pay with keyword rankings, and I'll focus on keyword rankings. And so I think at this point, you're starting to talk about building a brand as opposed to simply trying to drive downloads or trying to drive web hits. And I think that's a really pretty fascinating way to think about this, just from a brand building perspective, because it's very, very difficult to quantify that. And so how do you go about actually quantifying what is, a kind of an intangible concept in the brand?
Yeah, and we judge it based in almost as superficial with as much advanced metrics as I can add to it. And I say that to say we will post on Instagram that the podcast has dropped. So you can kind of tell by likes and that type of thing. That's a very superficial and unreliable way. And then in terms of metrics and judging success, so we get a lot of metrics, as I'm sure you two are aware. Everyone in the tech world, metrics will always be coming fast and furiously in any variety of it. And that does not mean they are any better than when metrics come flying at you than real life. So we have one source of truth that we know how many times that podcast, the RSS feed is accessed. So that's what we sort of use as our true north in terms of what's going on with the podcast, how are we doing? And the second way is feedback. We just like talking to people. And again, we both like talking to people on social media. So that's helpful.
So talk to us about a little bit about the behind the scenes of your social media presence. I mean, you guys have a huge Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you're on Reddit, you're on YouTube. How do you go about managing that and managing the brand across all those different platforms?
Chaotically, I would say, in a way that leaves room for improvement. Nate, one way is we've stuck to a very simple logo, simple, clean, not tried to get crazy with it. And the other way is my podcast co-host is very social media savvy, so he uses a platform where he can kind of manage it almost all in one. So he has a really cool program when he's live tweeting and live Instagramming and live doing events, which is a very different version. So we engage on live events in social media, which is really helpful, because it's surprising now, like, what a community of interaction that is. And there have been people that have come and gone to try and get us to come to exclusive places, like exclusive iRadios and that's never quite worked out. We resisted. We don't go. We like being kind of out where everybody is, and that's still Twitter, and that's still Instagram, and that's still Facebook. So that's where we do a lot of our live maintenance of it. So that's how we maintain that brand. YouTube is what we use for sketches, and we did to add, if we're just adding tips, and this is a great one. We did a huge merger with a lot of people that were in our same podcast category but didn't do comedy. So we invited some other media forms, a YouTube person that we know very well, John Evans, who does jiu-jitsu breakdown. He professionally breaks down matches so people can better consume and understand jiu-jitsu. He also has a school out in LA. He comes in and we all do a panel style interview where we review a grappling event and produce it. Essentially, we call it on the mat, like PTI.
Right.
So we call it around the mat is what it's great.
We actually, it was a pretty interesting format to kind of play around with, because you're forced to be deliberate with how you address questions. You can't start rambling in a 3-4 minute time frame.
Yeah, we edit it so we can ramble, and people do, and then we edit it down. Or there's your choice, which is the very fast, which is live. You can do it one of two ways, but as you know, it gets new viewers. That's what it does. Like, it gets people that are like, oh, I love Paul Moran from Open Bat Radio, which is another, jiu-jitsu podcast. Whoa, who are these two jackasses that seem to be making jokes along with Paul? This is great. And that's kind of one of the ways we've used. So YouTube's been very specific. We've used it for projects like that, video projects exclusively. So YouTube's kind of easy. The website is where we've had some room for improvement, and we're in transition because we kind of built a website. I was mentioning we just built a website for where we were 3 years ago, not where we are now and where we were headed, which has become a much more faster. This is my co-host's fault entirely, and I blame him frequently. People expect a fast comment from us now, which has become a good thing, but we'll also get a little flack if we're silent on some things. So we just weren't designed for that type of pace and to keep them all compartmentalized. And now we feel like some people have almost been going to our social media maybe a little bit more than our website, which not always good.
Right.
So, well, it's not necessarily always bad either.
No, it's not bad either.
It's just something. It's just something to factor in. Where
it's a lot of mediums.
Yeah. And you don't want to end up. I think the term I've heard is digital sharecropping. Where you end up building Twitter's brand and Facebook's brand and Instagram's brand instead of your brand on your own website. It's just kind of one of those things to be cognizant of.
Yeah. One of the things that I've used, and I've actually spoken at conferences about how do you play nice with social media and SEO. And one of the sound bites that I was pretty pleased with is, social media should drive the conversation, but your website should drive the story. The website is where you want people to end up. It's where you want to archive kind of the full and complete experience. But social media is a little bit more of that fluid, interactive, collaborative approach, and being able to kind of marry the two together. So, again, for Nate and I, our real focus is on SEO, where having the website is, doing SEO for a social media profile when the social media outlets are arguably the biggest competitors to your major search engines is something where it becomes very challenging in terms of driving organic growth, but being able to kind of have that tie back to the website. And again, as I said before, to allow social media to drive the conversation, but the website to drive the story.
It's fascinating. I actually like that a lot. I did want to make a point, and I'm definitely the story. That's good. I did want to make a point. You asked me earlier about the numbers, and this is something I tell every podcast, and I do try and talk about because radio and numbers have historically been one of those things. Like, if you think about why 90s DJs are so horrible, like the guys on radio in the 2000s, and they were so misogynistic, it's because they didn't have competition. And there was no way to know if they were doing well or not because radio was ridiculous. Podcasts completely erased that. So I think of it in terms of, pending what you're trying to do, I ran a live show in DC for 3 years, and it was a tremendous amount of work to get 25 people in the door for a month show. So just once a month, it was very difficult to get 25. It was that much harder to get 50. Getting 100 is some sort of miracle worker in the District of Columbia. So in terms of podcasts, I do like to think of them as, would I be impressed if this was a live show? Those types of numbers. And when you think about it in terms of that, it just changes it quite a bit, especially how many people you're able to impact. And that's why the podcast medium is one of my favorites. I like it.
No, yeah, I really like that perspective. I think all these new mediums, we have a gut reaction is to try to find the traditional analog and then just compare it with that when it's really completely different. And which for you guys, I mean, as a publisher, those kind of numbers also impact how you deal with advertisers. And, me and Brett are often on the marketing side trying to get the attention of publishers. I'm now on the publishing side. And so, could you talk about what is your experience being a publisher and getting approached by marketers, advertisers, trying to get a piece of your audience? I think you guys were once approached by Reebok. What's your perspective on advertisers? What would you recommend to them? How do you approach those kind of conversations?
Yeah. I'll tell a story because this is a very good question. Number one is don't be overwhelmed. And this is a story about how I was overwhelmed. The first time we were down at the Jiu-Jitsu Expo, someone asked us from a very good jiu-jitsu brand. He was like, so how do you guys sell commercials? And it was before I was prepared for someone to ask me that. I was like, what are you talking about? Commercials? Like, who would pay us to? And I got the nudge from my podcast host. It was like, perhaps that wasn't the most professional way to have handled it this early. And he's right.
Veil ignorance a little bit more than we are.
Maybe stop grinning like an idiot and talking. Maybe just grin like an idiot and don't do the talking would have been fine.
But I think
that
the other side of that,
it turned him off immediately.
Yeah, I would say to the other side of that though is how do your reaction is what gets you to learn. I know I've had situations with that. I've had things where I just haven't understood an acronym. I've been talking to e-commerce brands and not understanding some of the terminology there. But it's how you learn. By reacting to it, reacting publicly, you're forced to be held accountable to that reaction. And I think if you walk out of it and you say, "Ooh, I've kind of feel uncomfortable by that," it drives you to say, okay, well, why was that? Let's do more, or let's do less of what makes us uncomfortable and find a way to be prepared
lesson
for the
learned.
future.
Yeah. And I agree. I mean, it was a learning moment, as I call it now. So don't do that if you're listening and you're thinking, I just started a podcast, I'm about to get approached. We put a plan together that was pretty simple and kind of breaks down our numbers and what we feel like we could provide in a very fair rate. We've had people ask us to waive that rate. We've had people be absolutely fine with that rate. And that's sort of the standard easy answer. And then the more complicated answer is we'll also use that as a charity tool, right? We'll kind of give them away when people are looking for like, hey, Verbal Tap, do you mind having us on? It's like, no. And we'll also usually like throw in a commercial or two or a month's worth or how we break it down. We've also been approached, and to your point, and Nate was very helpful for me personally when I was going through some marketing questions. We got approached by a big company in the MMA world, Reebok. Yeah, we're still talking to them because they're a really easy company to work with for affiliate marketing, which is whereas people come through, the people that shop with MMA products would link through, and we get a kickback on that just for essentially providing the connection. Which is pretty standard, especially in terms of any major podcast you listen to. And I say major, like a top 10. That's what they do with Squarespace. That's what they do with Amazon. So it's a very popular way in the podcast community. And those conversations are usually pretty fun. It starts with, hey, let's talk about what kind of relationship are. Let's talk about parameters, and pretty simply. And we always embrace it as a really fun thing. And we enjoy it. We take it as a compliment anytime someone wants to do business with us. And our one and only question is always, do you want any creative control?
Yeah, I think the creative control conversation
wanting creative control
is always.
If someone did, that's a different check. No, I'm joking. No affiliate marketing and no marketing views have asked for creative control. But you will get people that definitely don't want their product. I mean, we're a comedy show, so we do warn them. Hey, the read can get funny. It won't get inappropriate, but the podcast is, it's a comedy show.
Yeah, and that's one thing with podcasts is, advertisers are paying for that custom read, and so a lot of times you have to deal with the more direct response side of the advertising people, who they're dedicated to getting the sale, not necessarily protecting the every single brand asset and every bit of brand tone of voice. And so, it's a trade-off and kind of a new world for both publishers and advertisers.
I think it's something that it's constantly evolving. I was listening to Dan Le Batard not too long ago, who's a sports kind of podcaster and radio personality. And at a certain point, he had been, he was the person who sold his, I think it was his MLB Hall of Fame vote, or one of those Hall of Fame votes. He sold it to Deadspin, or just gave it to Deadspin, who crowdsourced the response, and everybody kind of reacted, blew up over this. How it's the integrity of the vote. Why are we giving you a vote as a journalist? Yada, yada, yada. And he took a very staunch position that, this is, he is a satirist and this is what he does. his job is to go out there and to satire public events or common events. And he said, it's, I stand by that. And so he got very, in my opinion, he got a little bit too aggressive, considering that the people that he was bashing were the people who pay for the platform that he is bashing them on. And so you kind of do have to play the politics, I think, a little bit there. But to your point, you have to understand, what is it that is going to compromise our brand? And the creative control is something that, if I could, take a stab at defining your brand, creative control would have to be something that plays into what that definition would be, because it's fundamental. It's integral to the way that you and Raf have built Verbal Tab, not just the podcast, but again, the overall brand, including the YouTube sketches, including the Instagram and the other social media, engagement there, where when you move away from that, you start to lose touch with the audience that put you there. And then at that point, you're kind of in between, where do you have to find a new audience, or do you, if you're alienating your existing audience without having a new audience to move to, that is where you see a lot of marketing campaigns that kind of have the bottom come out of them. When you see successful campaigns that all of a sudden they disappear because they got away from what made them great without a clear understanding of the direction that they want to go to replace what they were giving up.
Yeah, you guys have I like the scientific answers, not the scientific. You guys are very corporate, and they're the tech side of the marketing too. This is the amazing side. But you also both are just so fantastic with the explanations. This is helpful.
It's one of the
walk
reasons
next
why
to me all day and just talk about the things that we're doing. It would be really helpful. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds better.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking before, where one of the reasons that, you were the first people we talked to when we were starting the podcast, because we wanted to know how to build the audience. But also for us, it was never about, it was always about being able to educate. Our thing was not to go out there and try to push our own brands. We think we do our intros at the beginning, but that's about it. Everything else, I've actually told Nate that he's got to be promoting a little bit more of the stuff that he's writing, because it directly applies to the conversations we're having. And even that's like pulling teeth sometimes. I think for us, what we always wanted to do is we wanted to use this medium as a platform to educate and to be able to give people an understanding that SEO in particular, and again, I think we keep coming back to that. We talk about marketing as in a general sense, but SEO in particular is very intimidating to people. It's intimidating to think that this massive computer algorithm, one of the most powerful companies that's ever existed, that has created this artificial intelligence to organize the world's information. And it's very intimidating to people. When in reality, the practice of SEO is frankly quite simple. You're going in there, building a website search engines can find, you're writing content that resonates with a particular audience, and you're finding other people that will validate and endorse that conversation. And when we can kind of nail it down to those fundamental aspects there, we start to say, okay, now what can we do? Nate and I talk about the flywheel all the time, where, getting that one spin of the flywheel. If we can use these episodes to get people that first spin, get a little bit of momentum going and make it a little bit easier for the next time and a little bit easier for the time after that, and have kind of incremental growth and incremental improvement every single day, that's where truly sustainable marketing comes into play. And that's where you start talking about these organic campaigns, where you start talking about a blog content, and maybe you can speak to this with ShiverWeb, where you start to write content years ago that is continuing to lead to the domain authority and generate momentum for new content that you're going to produce this week is going to be, and it's going to benefit from things that you've written in years past, and that momentum really helps drive further growth.
Oh yeah, well, Kevin, it's you talking about us giving explanations. It's been a real pleasure having you on to give our listeners a real life example where, I think me and Brett get, since we work in the SEO and marketing bubble, it's great to hear your business and your audience taking these kind of principles and applying them to something completely outside of the, SEO tech marketing bubble. And so it's been a real pleasure having you on. Is there any ask of our audience, now or later, that you'd like to make, or any kind of takeaways that you'd like to let people know about?
Absolutely. Number one, can't start doing it till you get in there. That's always, I just encourage it, because this podcast, so I've listened to you guys a few times. If I may compliment you, I love the dynamic. I love the back and forth. Love the topics. They're so helpful. And in that resource, when you're driving, you can't watch YouTube. So thank you, I guess, is a good way to say that. That's also what we try and do, right? It's all about entertainment, the podcast. Check out Verbal Tapcast Verbal Tap MMA Comedy Podcast. You can find us anywhere on any social media, anything. And that's usually the takeaway. If you have fun joking about MMA or wrestling or jiu-jitsu, come join us. If you don't, I'm really into the Serial podcast, so that's strongly recommended for anybody that's looking for just a good one in general. And were you asking about takeaways in general, or was this a final shout-out moment? Because I'm trying to think if I have anything.
Whatever you would like it to be.
Oh, beautiful. See, now you guys are just accommodating too. No, it's great. Thank you. I appreciate the time to come on. It's always fun. And the reason we do it, the takeaway, we pick something we love. That makes it easy to keep doing. And that'll take you through the breakup. So pick something you love, work with people you like. It'll be easy.
And to echo something that you said at the very beginning, almost in your introduction, find something that you enjoy doing and create the content that you would want to consume. The one thing, just to kind of remind our listeners here, the one thing that you said about how you decide whether or not something is worth publishing is, did it make us laugh? And I think not overthinking it, being able to understand why you're doing that, being able to say that there's got to be a benefit to you personally, because that will translate through to your podcast, that will translate through to people in the content marketing space. In order to get an audience to engage with your content, they have to be able to engage with you. And you've got to be authentic. You got to be able to provide that sense that somebody can form a relationship with you through this shared experience.
All right. Well, you can find previous episodes, links to things that we mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. If you don't want to miss another episode, go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app and leave a comment and rating while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings helps others to discover the show. We want to give a big shout out to Kevin Phillips and his co-host Raph at the Verbal Tap MMA podcast. Go check out their stuff. Check them out on the social. Check out their website. They'll all be listed in the show notes. And for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.